You all guys know that I am all for women reading romance and reading any sort of genre that they like or that they prefer. But some of you shouldn't even be considered readers. You guys are just addicted to sex. Hello, everyone. My name is Darkest Hour Reads, and today I want to talk about the addiction to sex in romance readers. Please accompany me to this journey, and as always, I am open to discussion. So please feel free to comment any ideas that you have, or if you want to follow me on social media, we can always talk on DM. Let's start. So this topic started in my mind because last week I went to my local bookstore, which is quite tiny and not very crowded, and I usually gravitate towards the fiction or science fiction sections. And for some reason, last week I felt like I wanted to read some good old romance, right? Maybe it's because I'm feeling like my teenage self is disappearing in my adult thoughts, which I hope is relatable for everyone that is over 25, because I'm feeling that way. But, anyways, I went to the romance section and I can tell you I was shocked. When I tell you I was flabbergasted, like this is an understatement because obviously I was just looking around, taking my time, reading all the back covers and reading the whole stories. And from all the books that I took, like I literally took and read, 10 of them were spicy and 10 of them had sexual content, which is shocking at the least, right? And I remember I was just over there looking around trying to find a book that had no spice or that had like minimal amount of spice. I could see nothing. Crickets. Absolute crickets. I was shocked. I immediately went back to fiction and science fiction because I I am just shocked. And I'm like just clutching my pearls over here like a boomer, right? Like this was a very hard experience for me to feel. And let me tell you why I am so shocked and flabbergasted. Because the feelings that I got at that time were indescribable. Disclaimer first and trigger warning as well. Obviously, you can read whatever book you want, and at the end of the day, my opinion is just mine. If you don't agree with it, please feel free to either comment and we can have a healthy discussion. But if you're taking this way too personally, I invite you to just stop watching the video because at the end of the day, it is not healthy for you and it's not healthy for me. But I do admit that I find a little bit concerning how often I see erotica and I see sexual content within the romance genre as a whole. And I think that is a very fair point to discuss. And I think it's something that has changed in the last decades. Romance as a genre in literature has been one of the, if not the most successful genre when it comes to sales. Actually, in the last year, the sales increased 53% only in the US, which I think is really impressive. But also, when we talk about the history of literature, romance has been a staple in all eras. So, the oldest examples of romance that we see are in ancient Greek history, for example, with these titles. We also can see romance in medieval eras, but I would say the real proliferation of romance as a genre in literature were thank you to precursor authors like Shakespeare, like Jane Austen, or Charlotte Bronte. And then I would say the actual explosion of romance literature were thank you to two different waves. So we have the first wave, which I would call the 1980s wave, and there were authors like Jude Devereux or Johanna Lindsay that actually brought the romance genre up into the literature scale, right? Like we have covers like these ones that you will obviously recognize the style of, and I think they are cunty AF. I love them. They are so fun. They look ridiculous in the best way possible, I would say. And obviously, thank you to these two authors and many more. We were able to find Romans, and we would not able to find Romans, but we were able to see a growth into the Romance literature and allowing other authors to also flourish in here. And then we have the second wave, which I would call the 21st century wave of Romance literature explosion, which we can clearly see as of right now. And I would say it is happening at this moment. We have authors like Ali Hazelwood, Elena Armas, Colleen Hoover, Anna Huang, Sarah J. Maas, all these kind of authors that where the main focus or where they are focused on is romance, even if it's fantasy, real life fiction, any type of romance, but they are all included within the romance literature, and they are making a huge explosion of romance, and that is why the romance literature sales have increased in the last years. And I would say that it is a great thing that people are now reading even more, but there are also certain specific conflicts that I have within this new era and wave of romance. Let me just tell you about it. First of all, I have to say that the two waves are related in a certain way, not only in the sense of both waves are actually connected by the romance genre or romance literature, but I also think that they come from a political and social statement and situation globally, right? So in the 1980s, for example, we see this growth in the romance genre or in the romance literature because there were a lot of policies, especially in the West, that worked for women's equality, right? For feminism. We have the third wave of feminism where we have, for example, abortion laws or pay equality that allowed women not only to gain more freedom for themselves, but also to be able to explore their own sexuality, which we can see that they are like women are exploring their own sexuality and desires and their own freedom or sexual freedom with the romance genre, right? Like we can obviously see it around here. But in this side, for example, I would say that it's more or less happening the same, or yeah, the same is happening as well. So we see the fourth wave in feminism where we see obviously freedom of sexuality, where women are able to explore their own homosexuality, for example, and lesbianism or sapphic, right? We see a huge growth into queer relationships, like woman loving women literature, which I think is great. And we also see all these abortion bans that we see in US, for example, with Roe v. Wade, that are also creating, I would say, an exploration into romance in general and how we relate with other men, for example, or how we relate emotionally and sexually with men. I also think it's hilarious the fact that these two waves, even though they are very different literary wise, I also think there's so many things that are very similar in the sense of like they are different but equal at the same time, right? So we have like very characteristic big covers, like you know exactly what I'm talking about in this sense, right? Like these two waves have their own specific type of covers. They also have a very specific type of male love interest, as you can see here, and also at the same time they always have the male character version of Ken, which is obviously in the 21st century they usually are either professors or insert any other type of normal profession. But then in the 1980s, you find pirate or barbarian or any type of fantasy like professions. And also, one last thing that they have in common is that both of them use mature sexual content. I also have to say that the fact that we changed the covers from these to these, I also think it really helped to open romance to the world, because obviously if you are a normal person in the tube reading these kind of things or these kind of covers, obviously people will be judging you in the tube. But reading these or just showing these around, I don't think it's as negatively viewed as these ones are, obviously for obvious reasons. But I also think that these ones are only obvious if you know the title or if you are into this genre and this community, right? And I also think it's something that has like impacted the way the sales actually raised, even though I think it's a pity that we forgot about these covers because I think they are great and I love them. This is such a dreamy aesthetic. I am so sorry. I actually did quite a deep dive about how many romance fiction books were actually spicy or actually had sexual content. And out of the top 50 of 2023, out of these 50 books, only two didn't have any sort of sexual content. Two. We're talking about 48 books that have sexual content or that include sexual content. Are you guys okay? Like, do you guys need help? This is very concerning. The fact that all the top books are sexual, in this matter. I just think it's concerning. I don't know what you guys think, and please leave it in the comments. But I even found books that were women loving women, for example, that also were male loving male. So there was I don't think it's a straight thing specifically. I think it's more a romance literature genre kind of thing. Like, this is something that no matter the relationship you can see, so obviously straight or gay or whatever you identify as, but it's a romance issue, which I think is really interesting. But let's dive into it. Again, disclaimer, you can read whatever you want. If you want to read erotica 24/7, I'm more than happy for you to do so. Like, you have the freedom to do whatever you want, but you also have the freedom not to watch this video. So what I'm going to say next is definitely going to ruffle some feathers. So if you don't really want to get to know my opinion or to see some research about sex addiction, please leave this video. I promise I'm not going to get mad, but you can do whatever you want. If you keep watching this video and then you get upset, that's on you. That's not on me. But going back to the discussion, I will always support people reading. Reading anything is better than not reading at all, right? But some of you guys shouldn't be considered readers. Some of you are addicted to sex. And let me explain. First of all, my credentials are that I am actually a clinical psychologist with a master's degree in biological anthropology. So I think I am allowed and I am an expert in human behavior, right? I know the ins and outs, I know what the whys, and I know what happens, right? First of all, talking about sex addiction, one of the tools that the healthcare department uses is this massive handbook called the DSM-5, and it is just basically a tool where you can see all the mental health diagnoses or all the disorders that we can see or we usually see as professionals. And unfortunately, there are no departments or there are no mentions of sex addiction as a disorder itself, but it is very heavily connected to other disorders as well. Taking into account the flourishing of fan fiction, as we spoke about 2 weeks ago, and also the new feminism wave where women have more power and more independency to explore their sexual liberation and their sexual desires, it is very obvious and it makes a lot of sense that romance and erotica as two different genres or as one genre altogether, that it flourishes and we get even more sales, top record sales from this last year. It just makes sense, right? Like, I would say that this is one of the best ways for people or young people to explore these sexual desires that they have. And I'm always up for it, taking into account the age appropriate tags as we always talk about. But I would say, first of all, research say that reading romance and erotica is a great way to explore yourself and to get to know what would you like, what you dislike, and just to be able to see and experience good and healthy, not only emotional relationships but also sexual relationships as well. So in this sense, romance also has quite a lot of benefits when it comes to women's own exploration, which I think sometimes we forget to talk about. And I think that's one of the best benefits that we can see. But obviously, there is also another side, which is the dark side of the coin, or the dark side of the moon, which is the possibility of people becoming addicted to erotica or to these kind of bits because of loneliness or because of any other types of situations or misfortunes that people can have, especially women. There is also a very clear sexual dimorphism when it comes about the type of compulsions that addicts have. So, for example, we see that men tend to do more physical activities, if you know what I mean, whereas women tend to internalize these compulsions and usually do mental emotional compulsions, which is talking or thinking about it, right? We also see a very clear difference in what kind of content, like adult content, these women and men use. So obviously, men tend to use more visual content, like corn we see, right? Whereas women tend to either use their own imagination to do these behavioral compulsions, or they use romance or they use literature and they read about these compulsions, which is what I'm talking about, which is the main beat of this video. So taking into account everything we've talked about, this sex addiction or addiction to sex, I would say that the main, or like the typical case I would see of this specific addiction in women are usually women that tend to be on the younger side, so usually either teenagers or late teenagers, young adults. But obviously there is also examples of women in their 40s, 50s also being addicted unto that type of scene, right? They also tend to be very compulsive and they would lack self-control. So obviously, for example, doing a lot of these sexual behaviors, like these ones, I don't think I can say it out loud, but we also see a huge obsession, and yeah, a huge obsession into what they are into, right? We see, for example, these women or these people constantly reading or constantly consuming these specific mature content, as well as it usually starts very innocuous. So you see the typical scenes or the typical videos or bigs that you could basically see on a vast, or like in the majority of society, that we don't think is that bad. So for example, I would say Ali Hazelwood, that's the best example that I have in my mind, right? Like, just because you read that content doesn't mean that you are an addict, but then it slowly grows into harder and bigger and more mature content that could also be dangerous for minors. But yeah, you see a growth into the specific interests that these people have, because usually when you read a normal romance or a normal spicy book, it doesn't hit the same because you have this normalization of behaviors or normalization of acts, and then you want to grow more into the extremes, right? So, for example, you start with normal romance and then you go to dark romance, then you go into mafia romance, and then you go into bigger, more extreme, and more darker paths, which can deeply, deeply influence the way you act or the behaviors or acts that you have, either with yourself, for example, or with other people, right? Which, if you are an adult that has their own frontal lobe developed, obviously you can discern what is healthy or what is not for you or what is actually dangerous. But as a minor, I don't think you have the ability to discern all of this, and then you can get into dangerous paths or dangerous communities where people can just use and abuse you. And I think that's something that we should be really concerned about. Obviously, as I mentioned before, not everyone that reads romance is an addict. You can very clearly and happily enjoy a good romance book, even erotica, if you are interested in it. There's nothing wrong with it. But when you are a big reviewer or a big blogger, and every time you post a video, you see this kind of comments, I think it's very telling about how the community is in general, right? It's obviously true that our community tends to be younger than the 1980s big community that was before, right? Obviously because of social media. But I think it's very concerning that we always find these bigs. And even me myself as a reviewer, I might be reviewing a classic book or a romance book that has no spice in it. And I always see comments like, where's the spice? What happened to the spice? Where's the smut? What are the pages that have the smut? You just want to read porn. Like that is the whole thing. If you are focusing on that story, just you are only focusing on those small parts of the story, you're not actually reading the story. You just want to read the corn. You want to read the mature content. That's the problem. And this is what I'm talking about. Like, I don't care if you read romance. If you are watching or reading books just for those scenes and then you just discard the book away, you are an addict and you have a problem and you need to solve it. You need to make it better, because that is only going to further hurt you. And as a conclusion, if you find yourself being addicted or feeling that you can't stop consuming this kind of content, please find help. Find anything that is available for you, either therapy, for example, or either free resources if you can't afford it. But you can get out of these and you can try your best to not become addicted into those senses, because you guys don't really understand how difficult these compulsions can be. And if you find yourself not being able to stop or not being able to even imagine yourself without this kind of content, please find help. You can get better. You can become better. If you need any help on my side, or if you just need someone to talk about these, please let me know. My DMs are open, my comments are open. I am always happy to help, because I've been in the same position as you guys and I came out of it and I made myself better and I worked on myself to be better. You can do it as well. Please find help. This is very serious, and it's much more dangerous than you guys actually think. Well, this is the conclusion for this video. I hope you liked it and I hope you learned something new. Obviously, my comments are open. If you want to discuss this topic, I'm always glad to do so. Thank you for watching. Give it a like if you want, and subscribe as well. And you can follow me on social media as well. Thank you guys. Bye bye. See you next week.